United States in Uganda, Your Excellency, the UN Resident Coordinator, Ambassador Eli, my colleague from Finchurch Aid, and all the other leaders, you are all welcome. And I would like to take this opportunity to really give a talk that is going to be different. Today, I'm not going to speak about the things that I speak about every day. Because I've realized that whenever I come to the Stanbic events, they feel very much like a fireplace than a workshop or a meeting. So I sort of thought I needed to do the Uganda style, where we tell stories. But you know, with stories, you risk the point either of boring people or making sure they are interested. But having said that, I'll just say one thing about some of the things which I think are important around the landscape, and then conclude with a couple of points. So let me start by saying that, will you manage the slides for me or I manage them? Let's see, sort out. Okay, she wants to manage them for me. Let's start with something quite unusual, which is my name. My name is Richard Ssewakiryanga. And the name Ssewakiryanga, I know when His Excellency Zulu met me, he doesn't want to pronounce it because it's very complicated. But that name Ssewakiryanga means something. And in Luganda, there is a proverb that says, Ssewakiryanga bw'okula ennaku olekayo, bw'olaba ennaku olekayo. What that means is that there is something deeper, that when you, as a person, go through life, in times of austerity, luxury is not an option. That is the economic term. But in plain English, I think the English used to say, make hay while the sun shines. So that's what my name means. So when my grandfather gave it to me, the idea was that this name would be written in full. Ssewakiryanga bw'okula ennaku olekayo. But unfortunately, Your Excellency, I was born in Zambia at the hospital next to your, when the nurse tried it, they realized there was never going to be enough space. So they asked, is there an abbreviation? Then the abbreviation was given as Ssewakiryanga. Now, Ssewakiryanga is also too long. I was complaining this morning when I was registering. But we are stuck with that. But the reason I'm bringing out this is because there is a more fundamental point I want to make, which is that when it comes to these discussions around development financing, I think the whole question of make hay while the sun shines is a very important question. Why? Because, go back one slide back. Why? Because, as we all know, and macroeconomics like Damon, whom I worked with in Ministry of Finance probably 20 years ago, is that this wisdom of making hay while the sun shines is wisdom that is not new. So the crisis we are in right now as a country, the crisis we are in as people, is not a crisis that has never happened anywhere in the world. These are crises that even our grandparents who were naming us were always knowing that they must find a time where they make hay while the sun shines. So probably what we should be saying is, have we been able to make our hay when the sun shines? Of course, when we look at the numbers, which is the next slide, globally, we are dealing with something that is a bit concerning. That when we look at things like official development assistance, we are very much down. Development assistance looks big, but if you compare it with what His Excellency Zuma needs to deliver the SDGs, it is a drop in the ocean. Because for the SDGs, what we need is up to 4.2 trillion for the SDGs to be met. But we know that ODA has only been providing 212 or so billion dollars. So in a sense, we know that that hasn't been very big. If you look at Africa, there were some interesting and very progressive statistics that were issued, which were shared, but we know that low-income countries are also still struggling a lot with debt distress. And I think that's where the very good idea that His Excellency Zuma talked about of debt swaps becomes important. Because indeed, there are many countries that are struggling with repayment. And for countries like Uganda, nearly 57% of our own resources in the budget are being consumed by this debt. So that means that it leaves very little room for hospitals, for this and the other. And yes, that's why we have to really rethink everything we are doing. And that's why we have to remember that we have no options but to try and get the hay made when the sun shines. Climate finance, we've just heard that there was at COP28, I think Ambassador Eli is the one who mentioned, the issue was to bring at least 100 billion annually, but we still fall short of that. Africa as a whole is receiving less than 10% of this. Now what that means is, again, we have a complicated situation. Because indeed for Africa, we are suffering the harshest impacts, but we are getting the least funding. So what this means is that in terms of conclusion, that yes, ODA matters, foreign direct investments matter, and all that. But the future of development finance now must be broader in terms of broader, but it also must be bolder in terms of being bold, and it also has to be smarter. And I think the ideas that are being shared now seem to be pointing in that direction. And for me, one area that I think we really also need to tap into, that we talk about and probably don't see enough about, is what Finchurch Head has just shown us here. Please move to the next slide. That, for example, when you look at what has happened, you have got philanthropists coming together and being supportive and connected to people. When you talk about retired people in Finland, out of their good hearts, putting $400,000 euros away and saying, go and help people. That is what humanity is about. Humanity, yes, is about trade, but it's about also connectedness. It's about feeling for people who cannot have what we have. And therefore, that's why, for me, I think philanthropic resources are something that we have to really think about. In Uganda, all across the world, last year only we had nearly $750 million, billion, not million, dollars, that were actually spent through these philanthropic organizations in development funding through foundations, Bill Gates and the others, Rockefeller, and many more, but plus also smaller partners who pattern differently. But the story becomes even much more interesting because when you return, and I think one of the first or second Stanbic events like this that I attended was in COVID. And when we were talking at that time, I think we all recognized that while everybody was going through a crisis, something interesting was happening on financing. That actually people were out there helping each other to survive and to go through the storm. You know, people went to hospital because another one decided, I'll give my bicycle to ride you, there is no taxi, to go and get your HIV drugs. You know, pregnant women whose husbands had been locked across the borders, and people would bring food and put it on their doorstep and help them. So these actions is what humanity is about, and it's something that we can never lose. So this whole generosity has to be expanded. In times like this, with the global processes changing, one of the things we really have to expand is generosity. And it's just the fact that generosity is one of the best ways we can build resilience. Yes, trade is good. Yes, development financing is good. But generosity is something that helps a lot. And actually, the statistics are very interesting. That in countries where you find people giving the biggest amount of time, talent, and treasure are sometimes the poorest countries. That if you go around and look, the people actually who help each other without asking for a return. If I ask many of the Ugandans here, their minimum number of people they help for school fees, for medical, whatever, is about 20. Many people don't understand that, but ladies and gentlemen, you are philanthropists, so you should clap for yourselves. So that's something that we have to put at the back of our mind. Now, if you turn to our country, I think there is something interesting, and Ambassador, His Excellency talked about it. We have an ambitious path, which we have defined. The NDP4 is a very good plan, because it has a certain level of ambition that indeed, if we pushed ourselves, we could go far. As I was introduced, I don't know if I was introduced, but I work now for the Center for Basic Research, but I also support the Office of the Prime Minister as a technical advisor. And His Excellency Zuma and me meet many times around issues of partnerships. But clearly, this ambition that we want to move from $50 to $500 million in terms of how we finance our development plan, I think is something that we should celebrate. But the thing about it is that ambition alone will not get us there. What will get us there is to create those baskets that can withstand the shocks that come. Because the shocks will come. Those who are Christians know that they tell you in the Bible, they don't tell you that if the shocks come. They say when they come, then you will have to bear with them. So it's never an option. We know that we have to go through shocks. So for me, it's important, but as we are ambitious as a country, ambition will have to be followed by innovation, by experimentation, by deepening partnerships, and many other things of that nature. So let me end, because I know that we have had so many people speak for today. And I have three, if you go to the next slide, proposals that I want to give. One is, I think, as development actors, and I have been lucky to have been around over 2.5 decades. My colleague, Mr. Damon, was saying, you don't change. Yes, I am trying not to change, because I want to be around for about 5 decades of development work. But development work, really where we need to go, is clearly we must deal with the issue of moving from silos to ecosystems, and we converge around these financing options. The US now has told us that, yes, they want to see trade. But what that means in practice is we have to ensure that private capital, the philanthropy I've talked about, the domestic revenues that we heard about, that all those streams come together in terms of a confluence. And it's at that point that we shall now be able to leverage the opportunities that come from financing. We know clearly that we cannot ever get to the type of finance we want if we are going to stay in these silos. Because for long, I can tell you, I spent 10 years as the executive director for the NGO Forum. We spent many years looking for money to finance projects, but very much looking for either philanthropic investments or some kind of grants from donors. But clearly now, what is clear is that that confluence has to happen. And I think we've been absolved by Finchurch Aid when they showed us some examples of how they are bringing development finance, private capital, and others to come in. So breaking silos is going to be one thing that we have to do. Another one is, of course, I will continue to emphasize the point around institutionalizing philanthropy. Why am I saying that? We give a lot in this country, but the challenge is we do not have a law or a legal framework that supports, that encourages that giving. And that we must do if we want to see people giving more. Yes, people can give a lot, but if we give and nobody thinks that giving is important, then certainly we shall only give to those things which we feel are connected to us. And if we are to move from that informality that I talked about, where everybody supports 20 people, and institutionalize and have laws that help us to structure our philanthropic giving, I think that will go a long way in actually supporting how we move through this development finance time. And lastly, the thing that is important for me is also to move from these types of transactional relationships to co-creation. That is a very critical thing, but it is also very tough. And what do I mean by that? As a person who has invested all my life doing research, I can tell you that what we need is to be able to build partnerships that allow for co-innovations, co-investments, building knowledge in a manner that helps us to see beyond where we are. And so this co-creation becomes an important thing. So whatever we do, even as we think about front-loading, making sure that business becomes part of our everyday practice, creating businesses that are located around the principles of co-creation, of how you want to work together beyond just the transactions, is going to be important. Because transformation really is not just about money. Transformation is also about how we make meaning, how we become, or how our relationships become meaningful together. So ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, there is another proverb in English that says opportunity only knocks once. And therefore, even us, we have to realize that this is one of the things that we have, that this moment is our opportunity to reimagine financing, to store hay when it is still, the sun still shines, to ensure that we build baskets of funding and financing that are diverse, that are resilient, but that are also people-centered, because that is very important. Because this is how we shall ensure that when this austerity is with us, luck does not become an option. So if we act together, if we innovate together, we have a lot that can come, because the evolving landscape of development finance will not have overwhelmed us